got that. Okay, so just to recap, what this hangout set up to discuss is an interesting little argument I seen earlier, like an argument for intelligent design based on DNA. So the argument runs like DNA is code. All other code that we know the origins of is the result of intelligent design. Therefore, DNA is the result of intelligent design. So that's kind of what we're going to try to be discussing. It's a very much an experiment for me, because I tend to shy away from these kind of arguments, but time to take the plunge and see what's going to happen there. Does everyone want to kind of introduce themselves? Just, well, we can't do it in order, like, just shout out and start a ball rolling until we get to the end. Who's in the hangout just now? You go first, Ozzy.
My name is Ozymandias Ramses II, and I'm an atheist, if that matters.
Tim?
Hey, just me. Listening.
Introduce yourself. Proverbs?
Yeah, I'm Proverbs 1:7, or Reggie.
You're Carlton. You there, Carlton? Yeah, we've got Carlton in here. He's an atheist.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm here. I just picked up the headset. Sorry about that. Hello.
My name is Yahweh.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we have Yahweh in here, allegedly, my God. Ilana?
Hi, I'm Alana.
Jimmy? Jimmy's always quiet there. It's okay. And then we have got Epicurus. Epicurus there.
What up? Not the actual philosopher, just someone taking the pseudonym.
Cool.
My personal beliefs are of a Catholic nature, so.
So that's who we have there. Probably going to be joined by new people as the hangout goes on, and as we can. So let's start the ball rolling. Do we have a sound argument, a sound deductive argument, or do we have a duff argument for an intelligent designer?
It's about as sound as, in my opinion, any other deductive argument. Well, it's not fully inductive. There are some deductive portions of it. For example, in the second premise, which is all code we've deduced so far has been programmed by an intelligent designer. This doesn't mean that there isn't a code out there that hasn't. So, for example, in the same way that just because we've always seen red apples in all our lives doesn't mean we can assume that there isn't a green apple out there or a yellow apple out there. That's Hume's problem of induction that I think most inductive premises have to try to get around. So that's one thing in the second premise that might not bode over well to someone who would agree with Hume on that particular instance.
I have a question.
But I just respond to that first. Like when I formulated the argument, I kind of, just to be clear, it's not my own argument. It's I was watching a series of videos on all this, and this was the initial argument in the introductory portion, and I said, oh, that looks interesting. So I reworded it a little bit, but the one thing I thought about is, because of what you just pointed out there, I kind of said this is better as a kind of probabilistic argument than proposed as a sound deductive argument, because two could be false just based on what you said there. It doesn't logically follow that just because every known code that we've seen thus far is intelligent design, that the next one's going to be intelligently designed. So I put in my rewording, therefore probably. But then I got a couple of responses I got was you can't have the word probably there, and I'm still quite not sure why. Anyway, you're a bit of a logician, Ozzy. Any particular reason why that wouldn't be in proper logical form with the word probably in the conclusion, rather than therefore DNA is the product of intelligent design, therefore probably?
Well, we have to distinguish between soundness and validity. Validity just has to do with the proper logical structure or form of the argument. Soundness has to do with the veracity of the premises. So ultimately what's going to be in question is whether the premises are correct. But as expressed, the argument is formally valid. That is, the conclusion follows from the premises. So if both of the premises are correct, the conclusion is necessarily true, because it takes the form of a strict syllogism of the modus ponens variety. A implies B, A therefore B. So provided that both of the premises are correct, the conclusion has to be true. The argument is formally valid, but that doesn't mean the argument's correct, because one or more of the premises could be false. So the soundness is still at issue, and I would challenge the first premise, and I would challenge the second premise. The first premise I think is I'm prepared to accept it provisionally. The second one, though, that the DNA is a code, I think is incorrect, but it's because I think there's a fallacy of equivocation in the sense of the word code in between the first and the second premise. So what we need here is we need a bridge principle. In order to make the argument go through, we need a kind of strict definition of what we mean by code here to make sure there isn't an equivocation between code in the first premise and code in the second premise.
So I mean,
or in the conclusion, rather.
So if we basically gave out the definition of code as like is usually, I mean, in my understanding anyway, of like what's his name, Stephen Mayer's. When they talk about code and DNA, they're not referring to Shannon information. They're referring to specified complex information, so that will produce meaning. So if we use that definition for code, and we use that consistently throughout the argument, then wouldn't that negate the equivocation?
No, not in my opinion.
I think it would.
I mean, yeah. If we go by that definition, you're right. It would, but I disagree with the definition.
Yeah, that's okay to disagree with the definition, but to avoid the equivocation charge, we need to have a clear definition of code that is consistently used throughout the argument.
Actually, I would agree with that definition, but I wouldn't agree with it being applied to DNA on its own.
Right. Same here. I would agree that that if you apply that definition, it's going to rid the argument of any threat of equivocation. But I don't think that you can legitimately call that code. Yeah, that's right.
Could you just recap for us what your objection was, Mr. Baboué, like the necessary but not sufficient?
Sure. So if you have the code if you have the symbols by themselves laid out, even if they're laid out in a pattern that in vivo, and in some cases in vitro in a lab setting, would form the amino acids. Well, we can form the amino acids from the DNA in the lab, but the only way we can do that is by putting in all the other important enzymes and other biofactors that go into translating the DNA. The DNA on its own cannot do anything. Those patterns of A, B, of A, U, C, or AT, C, and G, AU in RNA, by the way, won't code for anything unless they have the biological factors to do it. So really, it's not the DNA that's the code; it's just symbols.
But again, look at the premise one is the pattern in the DNA is code. It's not the DNA itself; it's the pattern within the DNA that's being proposed as the code.
Yeah,
otherwise, that is it's like the 4 letters of the alphabet. They're kind of symbolizations that always produce the same result.
Only under the right sorry, I'll let somebody else jump in, but only under the right biological factor. I mean, the symbols themselves, no matter how they are arranged, will never produce anything unless there's the right biological factors in place.
I just got a question from Matthew. I've been waiting for a while. I want to break DNA down as DNA is just simple sugar molecules and amino acids, do you need external force in order for that to happen? And I understand that we're going with the code thing, but does that necessarily attribute to a deity?
Well, once again, when you propose this argument to intelligence, you're not necessarily proposing a deity, and I think we need to try and be clear on that. Intelligent design, even if the people who propose intelligent design have a personal belief that God, the God of Christianity or the God of Islam or some other God, is that intelligent design, that's not part of the hypothesis that they're putting forward that DNA demands an intelligent mind to produce the code that would then allegedly go forward to produce life. So it doesn't necessarily propose a deity. But Ozzy, I think you were going to respond to Mr. Babui.
ACTG. Yeah, Mr. Babui, when you're talking about necessary and sufficient conditions, I agree completely that the alleged code of DNA isn't causally sufficient to produce anything. And you need all of this machinery of the cell for this to happen. Well, I mean, we can do it artificially, but in vitro. But I mean, ordinarily, in vivo, it happens within the machinery of a cell or something like that, or with RNA have slightly different viruses and stuff like that without a cell. But I don't think that you want to sort of stake the distinction between DNA and software code on that, because even software code is inert and doesn't do anything and doesn't code for anything until it's instantiated or realized in a medium. It has to be realized or instantiated in a piece of hardware. If you write your software out on a piece of paper, it's not good for anything. It doesn't do anything. The sense in which it codes for is the sense of predictability. It's only when you instantiate that code in the right kind of hardware, only then is it going to be part of the causal necessity to produce the effect. But by itself, no software is causally sufficient. And I think that's as true of DNA as software and vice versa. So I don't think we can make the distinction along those lines. Does that make sense?
Sure. I agree 100%. So I would retract the computer example maybe, but I would just say that that the first premise, when it talks about the pattern, it defines the pattern as the code. You see? Yeah. So that would be, in essence, going back to your argument about computers, that would be in essence dividing the 0, 1, the hexadecimal system, the binary system in computers as the code, which it by itself wouldn't be. It would just be the symbols that allow the program to function.
Yeah, but the same argument hold. I mean, you could write down the symbols in a computer program, a software program, on a piece of paper. That's what's going to.
Yeah, and you wouldn't define that as a code, right?
No, that is the code, but by itself, it needs to be basically put through a medium to be realized.
Yeah, I would say that if it's on a piece of paper, it's just symbols. If you put it into a computer, then it becomes a code.
Well, and I would
because if you're using binary or something like that, and you're trying to get a computer to do something, and you're just working it out in your mind before you make it into a software program, and you actually write down specific binary or hexadecimal to get the result when you put it into hardware. So you know what you're doing. You're not just picking binary and things into your head and lumping it all together and saying, oh, I hope this produces a Google+.
I used to write code, and I used to put it inside a computer. It still didn't do anything unless when I click a button and it told it to run the program.
Well, yeah, that's what we're saying.
But
that's the argument against what Mr. Babui is saying. The code itself, it's necessary to get what you want to happen, but it's not sufficient in itself, just standing by itself, to do that, to achieve that. It has to be in a medium before you get the result. Now, can anyone point me to some sort of code that wouldn't apply to?
Well, can I chime in for a second here? Am I on live?
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry about that. isn't there? I'm trying to meld these two ideas in my head there and keep Ozzy's objections in mind. If you have the code, that doesn't matter if it's computer code or not. But if you have these four chemicals in certain patterns, just like a computer code. Okay, let's do that. If I'd write zeros and ones down all day long, okay, there's this argument being made that that doesn't constitute a code because it doesn't in and of itself do anything or have any effect. And Matthew, you're saying, however, when we find it in conjunction with a CPU and a computer, then meaning does emerge as a result of that. Therefore, you can make the case that there had to be some sort of intelligence in the creation of that initial code. And I think what I might ask is, couldn't that also be the result of a filtration event? And what I mean by that is, if I write those zeros and ones, okay, and I put them on a CD and I stick that CD in my laptop, it might do something. Hello there. But if I take that same CD and that same set of symbols and I stick them in a Macintosh, it's not going to do shit. Pardon me, we're live. Squat. Okay, it's not going to do anything. So the numbers have no meaning in that environment at all, and no one would make the argument that there was an intelligence involved when they look at that set of digits in a Macintosh. Is it not feasible that DNA simply is an organization or an arrangement of chemicals, which possibly, it exists in the living things that we see simply because that is the only place where it was functional, and that in any other environment maybe where those chemicals may have found themselves during the history of the Earth, they were nonsense. They were meaningless to the environment in which they found themselves. So and what I'm getting at there is that I'm not sure then that you can necessarily say that there had to be an intelligence behind that simply because there's a match that we observe between the digits and the processor of those digits. It seems like that could have been happenstance, and certainly there may have been other combinations of those two that never survived because it was meaningless.
No, I mean I wouldn't accept that for the following reason.
Okay.
Even if you wrote code out to put in a Windows
Sure.
basically computer, and then you left it on your table, and someone took that code and tried to get it to operate on a Mac, and it was useless, that doesn't negate the fact that the code is a product of intelligent design, or you basically sitting down and carefully structuring your code for a specific purpose to operate on a specific system.
Right.
The fact that someone else took that and tried to misapply it.
No, not someone else.
Would it negate the fact that it is a product? The code itself is still intelligent.
Let me correct what I said, because I think you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to get at. Let me do a different analogy. To me, this sounds very much like the argument that that humans in and of themselves are intelligently designed because we find them on Earth as opposed to any other planet. That there is a blend or a good mixture of the environment we find ourselves in and the fact that we're here and our requirements to survive. Right? Why aren't there human beings on Venus? Well, because the environment on Venus wouldn't support us and the requirements that we have. I think the same argument could be made for DNA, that we see it in a living being and we consider it a good match because that's where it happens to be, where it can survive, where it has meaning. But that doesn't imply that there was meaning given from the outside. In other words, that DNA, those chemicals may have formed in a particular pattern outside of living material as well, but they were useless there. They served no purpose, so it faded away. Yeah,
but the thing is, though, and if you look at the argument, you need to look at every other code that we know the origins of. So this is, I mean, you get these things on the internet, like the James, I think everyone's heard of the James Randi challenge. I think you get Shanna sometimes makes reference to the Nobel Peace thing for the, what is it, Shanna? Realism or?
It's a Nobel Prize being offered to demonstrate that naive realism is true.
Yeah, like $500 or something, Is it a bit more?
Maybe a little more than that.
I can only work on it for 2 hours then.
Could I retire on it?
I think the Nobel Prize is $1 million.
Well, there you go. So you get these, you get these kind of things out there. Now, the challenge I've seen from this guy today on this video series I watched was basically, okay, just present us with an example of code that we know the origins of, which is not a product of intelligent design.
Well, and that's exactly my point. Is that
I think.
Well, no, but for exactly the same reason as the point I'm trying to make, in that it wouldn't survive in an environment where it served no purpose. If we're talking about living things here, it simply wouldn't. In the same way that if I wrote code for a PC and I put it in a Mac, if it wouldn't survive, it would be meaningless. It wouldn't be deemed. It wouldn't be deemed. It wouldn't be visualized as code. It simply would be a random pattern. So that's what I'm saying is the only things that we do see, we see them because there is a useful connection between them. There's a symbiotic relationship between the two.
But the thing is, though, you're still not addressing the fact that if you wrote a code for a PC and then someone took it and tried to use it in a Mac, you're still not addressing the fact that code was still intelligently designed by you for a specific purpose.
Yes.
Can I come quick? Sorry, real quick. Just to come back on that point and Ozzy's point about computers.
I'm going to write some more code.
Necessary and sufficient, but they need the actual computer to function. Whereas and DNA is the same way. DNA really, if you look at it, just forms the proteins. There's like DNA itself can't lead to the protein folding that occurs, the specific differentiation of cells after they've been formed. I understand that you could say, well, that's part of that mechanism that continues, but I think, like even when you form a protein from DNA in vitro, you can't get it to fold and differentiate in the way that it does to form organs and tissues. So I still say that it's insufficient compared to the actual organism.
Well, if I can ask one more quick question, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want to ask this one. Matthew, do you speak another language besides whatever it is you speak?
I think
English, I think.
When I'm not online, I speak Scottish.
Broken English.
Okay, but my point being, even in English, we have words that we consider synonyms, right? But they even the synonyms typically have some different shade or variance of meaning. It might be very slight, but they typically do. If we're gonna argue an intelligence behind DNA, we have 4 chemicals there, which means we have 64 permutations, and yet we only derive 20. If I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, Eddie. We only derive 20 proteins. So a lot of those same series code for the exact same protein, but they're different letters. Does that imply intelligence as well?
Yeah, I mean, the thing. Yeah, I think it does, because you have the pattern within the code, right? I mean, if anyone who grants that within DNA there's a pattern in DNA that is a code, if someone accepts that premise, then the argument goes through, because no one can point to any other code that we know the origin of that is not the product of intelligent design.
What makes it a pattern?
What makes it a pattern is when you see the same combinations and you put letters to those, you always get the same result. So if you have AAA, well, yeah, like in the double helix, like you'll have in the double helix.
But that's not a pattern. That's not intrinsic. That's not intrinsic to the letters.
No, it's intrinsic to DNA to have that pattern. Are you saying that in DNA there's no pattern within DNA?
I might be able to clarify this a bit.
Okay.
If,
Please, Oz.
I got a question later. Go ahead, Oz.
Okay. The argument works by analogy, right? The idea is when we look at what we call codes, whether it's a code in cryptography, like a literal code, like during wartime, or where it's a substitution cipher, where I scribble out a code where I say let A equal 1 and B equal 2 and C equal 3, and then I can write out the Bible or Shakespeare in numbers instead of letters. That's a substitution cipher. It's technically not a code, but I mean it's a kind of code. Everything that we call a code, whether it's this kind of thing, cryptography, or whether it's a set of formal symbols like the letters of the alphabet, which represent phonemes that we speak in English. Okay, that's why we have a phonetic alphabet. These symbols are ways of visually representing sounds that come out of our mouths, and words are codes for sounds that come out of our mouths. And when we think of software codes, in every case, these are instances of an intelligence. And the idea is now, if we look at the living world and we look at these nucleic acids, ATCG, and how they form base pairs, they reliably produce
the same amino acids.
The same amino acids that get synthesized in the right machinery of the cell. They synthesize proteins. Okay. Now that's where the code is. When biologists speak of code, or geneticists speaking, is that this codes for that. A certain arrangement of nucleic acids, base pairs of them, reliably, causally produce certain amino acids that can later on in the machinery of the cell synthesize proteins. Okay, it's that sense that it's a code. That's the pattern that Matthew is talking about.
Sure.
Okay.
But Ozzy, so you have a code, like you said, a ciphering code. Okay, a cipher, and you have B equals 2, A equals 2. You need a person to come along, look at that, and just simply change the numbers into letters, and he gets Shakespeare, for example.
Right.
With DNA, there is no person that comes along and does that.
Right, but
it's
of
all
course,
chemical.
Right. No, but that's okay, because when you have a computer, the computer does all that. There's no person there. Right? The idea is an intelligent designer designed the software, an intelligent designer designed the machinery in which the software is realized. And Matthew's analogy works the same way. The DNA code was designed by an intelligent designer. We don't need to beg the question what that designer is. It could be something from another planet, or it could be a deity. It could be who knows. We don't need to beg the question of what it is. But the idea is, in potentia, it is an intelligence that designed both the code and the hardware in which it's realized, namely the machinery of the cell and the beings that we are and stuff like that. So the analogy, I think, works as an analogy to that extent. I think the analogy breaks down somewhere else, but I mean, at least we want the argument to sort of be sort of articulated before I try to
I just
poke
got
a
a
hole in
question
it.
for Matthew. Do you agree that a ape's DNA code is 94% just like ours?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a biologist, but if that's what the claim is, then I have no reason to doubt that. Yeah.
So, you do agree with evolution?
Yeah.
As far as common descent?
Yeah.
I think. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm done.
I think maybe we're getting. Well, I think part of the problem is the use of the word code to begin with. I think a lot of people just disagree that DNA is really a code at all.
Right.
The word code was first used by biologists in order to explain to lay people how DNA worked, but it isn't like a code in any other code that we ever speak of. So if we can show that the DNA is different from every other code in the world, then there is a sense in which DNA is not a code like any other. Would you agree with that, Matthew?
That's where my objection is going. Yeah.
Yeah, but
okay. Well, let me tell you. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, no, this is great. Go, Lana, please. Go ahead.
Okay. No, go ahead, Matthew. Sorry.
What I was going to say is on this video series I'm referring to here, what they did is they tried to make that analogy by basically representing it by a computer and saying, like, a computer program, there's going to be in that system, there's going to be like an encoding process, the code, and a decoder, and they're saying that you find the exact cell same in DNA.
Right. Can I tell you how it's different?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. There's a very, very, very important difference between any computer code and DNA, and that's this. Any computer code that you have, the symbols can be changed. Okay, you can. There are hundreds of computer languages that can all code for the exact same things. Okay, and even if you were to take a single computer language, you could change the symbols, and still achieve the same results just by changing the way the program compiled. Okay. With DNA, it's chemicals. Okay, the base pairs code for nucleotides. The nucleotides are seen by messenger RNAs. This produces proteins. It's a chemical reaction like any other chemical reaction. You can't change the letters because the letters are chemicals. It's the only code in the world, the only code that we're talking about. Okay, if we're going to use the word code, where you can't change the elements at all. So it's not the same. It's just not the same as any other code.
Yeah, the symbols are constant.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, analogies are never meant to be perfect. They're never meant to be perfect representations of what they're, analogizing to. So I don't see how that would materially affect the argument. Like, if it's recognizable as, like, if in DNA you have recognizable patterns, and those patterns, you can get them translated, and you have this encoder, code, and decoder thing the same way you have in there. Just because in DNA it has a unique function doesn't take away the common attributes that it shares with other codes.
There's no decoder. It's just a chemical reaction. There's no decoder.
Yeah, I was going to speak to this. Is it okay if I inject myself here?
Sure.
Okay, Matthew, here's why I agree with Alana. We have the same objection, perhaps not coincidentally.
By design? By intelligent design?
Certainly I think it's intelligence. Yeah, the reason I think it's a relevant disanalogy is not merely that there isn't a decoding device operative here, and it isn't even that the relevant symbols are unalterable and can't be changed or substituted. Okay, it's also the fact that the sense in which code is being used here is figurative. It is intended, as Alana said, as a means of explicating how a biologist and a geneticist knows what proteins are going to be synthesized. This is a causal relationship. It is strictly a matter of causal necessity that certain base pairs produce certain amino acids that ultimately get synthesized into proteins. In other words, if you know what the product is, you know what nucleotides had to be involved, which base pairs had to be involved. So to say that something codes is to say that this codes for that. So the sense in which this is a code is merely the sense in which we can look at one set of physical events or one set of physical phenomena, namely the base pairs, and then there is a perfect causal regularity that results in the production of a certain amino acid. And that's the sense in which it codes. It's simply a matter of prediction. It's the same way that we say that where there's smoke, there's fire. Smoke codes for fire. I don't have to see the wind or hear the wind. I just have to see the leaves rustling, and I know that there's wind. The rustling of the leaves, because it's reliably caused by the wind, I can say that the rustling of the leaves codes for wind, and that's the sense in which that there's a code here. There's no other sense in which there's a code here, and that's why I think the analogy breaks down. It's it is just a figurative use of the word code. There's no now, this is not to say that there isn't a designer behind here, but it can't hinge on the concept of code. So I think that the argument from design can still be pressed, but I don't think it can hinge on the concept of code, because code is applied here figuratively, not literally.
So, So yeah. But on that basis, then, would you be saying then that there is no pattern within DNA?
No, there's absolutely a pattern. The pattern is, in fact, the pattern is much better than in any software, because in software the pattern is somewhat arbitrary. The code could have been written otherwise than it was. Any other set of symbols could have been used. You can instantiate the same output using a completely different set of symbols. You can use a different language. You could use the same programming language and write in a bunch of redundancies if you wanted, or something like that. You can write the code an indefinite number of ways and get the same output. So the input-output function would be identical, even though the code that mediates between the input and the output could be completely different, even if it was written in the same language. But that's not true with DNA. It's never true with DNA. This is a matter of strict causal, and it's as invariant as what causes ice to melt into water, and that that if you rub two pieces of wood together fast enough, you're going to get combustion. It's a matter of strict physical causal necessity. There's no sense in which anything is, in an abstract information theoretic sense, coding for another thing. There's no information theoretic analysis here that can be given except by a kind of charity, where we'll say, well, we're going to treat this as an information theoretic system. We can do that with any system, though. I can take anything. I can describe water going from a solid state to a liquid state, and I can describe that formally in software, but we don't say that the software is relevant to the causal explanation of how ice melts and turns into water. So anything is formally describable if there's any physical regularities at all, but the software does not play a role here in physical systems. And so there's no software here, and there's no decoding going here. Now, that's not to say that the system wasn't designed. The system could have been designed, but the evidence for that design, I don't think, can be found based on the analogy of a code, because I think code is being lent here. It's kind of like it is a heuristic device. It's a way of explaining to lay people how biologists and geneticists are able to read off, as they say, what proteins will ultimately be synthesized by looking at the base pairs.
Okay. So, but everybody agrees there's a pattern in DNA, yeah?
Yeah. Oh no.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's no question. There's absolutely a pattern.
Definitely there's a. So let me try.
I do have a question.
Cool. Go ahead.
The decoding happens during transcription.
How is
I
that?
guess it was really so much a question.
It's not a decoding. It's just a chemical reaction.
I agree.
Transcription is a chemical reaction. It's just a chemical reaction, just like crystals forming or any chemical reaction. DNA forming proteins is just a series of chemical reactions, just like what would be the Krebs cycle in plant respiration. Is that right?
Photosynthesis.
Yeah.
Anything like that.
It's just a chemical reaction.
Right, but I don't think that takes away from the decoding going on.
Well, how is it decoding? What's being decoded? How could it be decoded differently, even in principle?
What do you mean by decoded differently? I don't think that it can be decoded differently.
Right, exactly. It can't be decoded differently for the same reason that if you rub two sticks together fast enough, you can never get any other result than combustion, right?
But I don't think that hurts anything, though.
Well, the symbols aren't arbitrary; they're chemicals, right? They can't do anything but what they do. Whereas with any other code, the symbols can do anything. They're just symbols. Like when you write a page of script, okay?
Right.
The symbols.
I heard you when you explained it before.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, but I still don't think that hurts the argument at all.
Well,
because
it shows
the symbols, which are basically just the chemicals, the ATCG, lined up in whatever order they need to be in, represent something other than themselves.
They don't represent anything, though. They are reliable predictors, right? Does that make sense? They don't represent, right? They are what they are, and they cause what they cause, but they don't represent something else. You hit the nail on the head with the word represent. In software, strictly speaking, with software, what you have is computational elements, okay, or you have computational rules over formally defined elements. The formally defined elements are sort of, you know, the zeros and ones, let's say, okay, and the computational rules are the sort of the normal rules that we see instantiated in logic gates, you know, like if-then statements and statements and or statements and not statements and things like that. So what you have in software is computational rules over formally defined elements. The formally defined elements don't stand for anything in particular except that which we declare them to be. So you can actually write a code and say, okay, I'm going to run this code now on this machine, and what it means, what the output is up to you. The user literally can define what the software output on the screen means.
I agree.
But that's not the case with organisms and DNA. There's no interpretation to be lent to what comes out. What comes out is a pile of chemicals, right?
Yeah.
Is proteins.
Yeah, but can I go back to that pattern stuff? We all agree. I'm trying to find. We all agree the patterns there. Okay. Now, if I take that, like, if I was a cryptographer and I was presented with some, like, I was presented with some sort of code, or it was presented to me as code. Let's not judge whether it was or not. Like, just a whole bunch of symbols, and I was said, listen, this might be a code that might be important. We need to try and get this decoded in case it has an important message in it. And what would I look for? Wouldn't I look for patterns?
Sure, yeah, of course.
So,
but that's not what makes it a code, right? Code. Sorry.
The decoding process. But I mean, if I was going to decode it, what I would look for patterns in the symbols.
Yes, you would. But
right, and
pattern by itself is
in DNA.
Right. No. There's no question that there's patterns in DNA. There's patterns throughout nature, and there's patterns when we write software. But patterns aren't sufficient for being a code, right?
Yeah, but let's say I was completely, well, I am. I don't need to pretend here. Let's say I was completely ignorant of all the DNA stuff and chemistry and all that kind of stuff, which I am. And I was presented with just this whole bunch of letters and symbols and all that kind of stuff that, to a geneticist type thing, made sense to them, or elements within it made sense to them. So there was a genetic code was written in with this whole other bunch of stuff. And again, like, if I was to try and decode that, I would be looking for patterns.
That's true, but here's something to consider. Supposing that I were to give you the pattern, okay? And I mean, it's simple. It's, you know, A goes with T and produces a certain amino acid. C goes with G, produces another, and various combinations thereof, resulting in proteins. Now, I could give you all of those base pairs and all of the combination and permutations and show you the resulting proteins that are going to result. Okay, and that's going to be reliable and invariant. Okay, so there's the code. There it is, right?
It's always in triplicate, by the way. Sorry, I know that's irrelevant.
Yes, that's right. No, you're right. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah. So I could give you this this code. I could actually lay it bare in front of you. Here's the code, and you go, oh, cool. Okay. Now, if you don't know what they are, you don't know what they are, right? But if I say, okay, well, no, but the A is adenine, and C is cytosine, and G is guanine, and T is thymine, and here are all of the amino acids that they produce, and these are the proteins that get synthesized and stuff like that. Then you go, okay. When you go, oh, how about that? This thing codes for that thing. That is, as long I know that whenever I see this triplicate, this triple that I'm sorry, who was that said that? Mr. Bababooey pointed out. Whenever I see this, I know that I'm going to see this protein synthesis happening over here. That's terrific. But once you understand the chemistry of it, you realize, oh, wait a minute. There's no coding here necessary. I don't have to posit any interpretation or decoding that has to happen. I can see that this is strict physical causation. This causes this. That is, these base pairs instantiated in the system necessarily produce this. It's strict physical causation. There's no other interpretation that can be lent to it. Compare that with a piece of software. If I hand you a piece of software and I say, okay, here's a piece of software, here's the inputs, here's the outputs, here's the software. And I can even tell you the architecture of the machine. I can say, you know, if this is a von Neumann architecture, or it's a massively parallel processing system, a different kind of neural net or something like that. And there you'll understand all of the physics of it. Even with all that information, you will not know what that software is for. You won't know if this is a natural language program. You won't know if that's a chess-playing computer. Why? Because ultimately, we have to lend an interpretation to these symbols to know what the heck the output means. But that's never the case with these biological systems, and that's why I think this is a disanalogy. But I want to hasten to add, this doesn't hurt the case for intelligent design, because I think the case for intelligent design, I'm not a proponent of intelligent design. I think it's incorrect, but properly construed, the case for intelligent design doesn't rest on this idea of code. So I think there is, in fact, an equivocation between the two senses of the word code. We have literal code in the case of things like language, software, alphabets, things like that. Those are literal codes that require intelligence, encoding, decoding, interpretation. And in the case of the biology, we are sort of calling this a code by a kind of courtesy to help explain how a biologist is able to predict a certain biological product from a certain set of antecedent biological preconditions.
So when you use the word code, and when, like, Stephen Mayer, for example, who wrote, I think it was Darwin's Doubt and the Signature in the Cell, things like that.
Yeah.
They are defining code as specified complex information.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is, you're saying basically that's false.
Yeah, I think they're getting it wrong. I think that what's happening is they have fallen for. I mean, it's very common. This happens within people who work in software, and it happens to people who work in biology. Usually, the people who are able to sort of recognize this analogy are people who happen to work in both. Ilana actually has a background, did her doctoral work in quantitative genetics, and she also worked as a software instructor, teaching how to program.
That's just cheating. If I'm going to present an argument from DNA, you can't invite someone like that onto the
I didn't invite her. I didn't invite her. You invited her.
Oh my goodness! Shoot myself.
But I'm saying this is why, like, it so happens that Ilana is kind of uniquely positioned here to be able to sort of see both sides of this and to recognize the disanalogy that's not apparent to people working in one field or the other. It kind of helps if you, as she does, straddle both these fields. Now, she's not. I mean, this is not original to her. A lot of people have noticed this before. Philosophers like John Searle, Daniel Dennett, and others have and they don't even agree on anything having to do with software and artificial intelligence. These guys are bitter enemies. But you know, they both recognize that there's this disanalogy here. But I mean, we're so used to talking about DNA in terms of code. It's kind of ineluctable. It's almost unavoidable that we would think of it as one thing literally coding for another, and because what the cell does is enormously complex and work almost like an input-output function. That is, you go from one set of physical condition to another set of physical conditions. You go from these base pairs, and you end up with these protein synthesis. That it's very, very intuitive to describe what happens in the cell as a kind of decoding process, which is exactly what Shanna was recommending.
Well, so much of the language is like that, like what Shanna said, transcription. You know,
yes.
that's a word that makes you think. Well, in genetics, it actually means copying, not decoding. But still, words like copying and words like reading DNA or reading DNA into RNA, these are all, you know, words that have to do with codes. I mean, because language is a code, right? Or written language is a code too. So these are all words that remind us of codes. But when it comes right down to it, it really is just all chemical reactions.
Yeah, it's a borrowed vocabulary.
Yeah. If I could just step in here, and I'm going to admit scientific ignorance. I'm an art student, so I'm not fit to go into a laboratory. After this, I'm probably fit to crying your Starbucks coffee. But in terms of the coding analogy, how would coding software be different from, say, genetic engineering, wherein DNA is perhaps I'm not too familiar with the process, but a quick wiki search has told me that it's done by inserting a new DNA into a host genome, whatever that means to me. How would that differ from software engineering, for example, where codes are, I assume, switched in and out to have new outputs?
Well, did you want me to speak to that, or Alana, or somebody else?
Well, I'd actually prefer the person who has a background in both, but if Ozzy, you can speak to that, go right ahead.
Well, no, I mean, it's better if Alana answers that if she has thoughts on it. I know a little bit about this, but...
Well, software engineering is writing code, and genetic engineering is taking pieces of DNA which code for proteins that you already know what it codes for, and inserting it somewhere else. So basically, you're moving pieces of DNA around into various organisms or whatever. It's not writing code.
Yeah,
it's moving code.
Yeah, to say that it codes for is merely to say that you can predict with absolutely perfect reliability, based on the laws of chemistry, what will be synthesized from the base pairs.
Or the
combinations of the base pairs. I'm sorry?
How did we come about this knowledge?
Well, I actually don't know enough about the history of the science of genetics to know how we came about this.
I don't know a lot about genetic engineering too either, because I'm not a genetic engineer. But when we actually, I don't know enough about it.
Well, I mean, I know that we do things like electrophoresis, for instance, and stuff like that. We have techniques like that allow us to figure out what is the genetic structure of things, and then we're able to literally in the lab we're able to actually monkey around with these chemicals and produce certain byproducts. We know these things in the same way that we know that if you mix two certain chemicals together, you get a certain chemical reaction and a different product. Right.
Yeah, because I'm tempted to say, obviously DNA was discovered. Whenever it was discovered, DNA was discovered. Mm-hmm. So it's not always been known to be there. So I'm always tempted to say that DNA was there, the pattern within the DNA was there, and we decoded the pattern, or we came to recognize the patterns, and
no, we didn't.
We came to recognize the patterns.
Yeah, I just like to oversimplify things. To me, a pattern is just repetition. So the fractals also is a repetition. Does that mean an intelligence created repetition? That doesn't even make any sense.
I don't think that's the argument, though.
You're saying you're attributing a pattern to intelligent design.
No, not the pattern itself. If you look at the argument, the pattern is just premise one. There's a second premise there, and I think that's where the charge of maybe equivocations coming in there, and then you have the conclusion. So it's based on two premises, not just one.
I think. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Alana. Sorry.
I was just thinking that maybe some confusion is coming in. Matthew, do you think that we can look at the DNA sequence and know what it's going to code for just by reading it? Because we can't. The only way we know what DNA codes for is because we're able to isolate areas that code for proteins and say, oh, okay, this piece is making this protein, but we're not able to read it. We're only able to read it after the fact, after we figured it out, after we figure out that this piece is making this protein, then we go, oh, okay, we can recognize that pattern. But we're not able to read along it and go, oh, okay, it's going to make this, it's going to make this, it's going to make this. It's just chemicals. And it's only once we've seen what the chemicals are doing that we go, oh, okay, these chemicals are doing this over here, and these chemicals are doing this over here. Does that make sense?
So it doesn't produce meaningful information.
Not to us, not until we already see the effect.
Yeah, but that would be like if I go back to if I was given this German secret code that was going to determine the outcome of the war, and I began to see patterns in this code, then when I seen the same patterns, I would know that, okay, these patterns here, they code to this. They always code to this. So
so you're able to.
I would be seeing it after the fact, but I would still be decoding a code.
Right, but you'll never be able to read the rest. Okay, so if when you decode a code, a real code, at some point you're going to be able to read something else in that code, right?
Well,
you'll have decoded code. You'll know what the next thing written is going to mean, even though you haven't seen that particular pattern before.
If I finish the process of decoding and I know what every pattern means, and if I crack the code, then yes, it will make perfect sense to me when I read it. I'll be able to read that as if it was English. In fact, I'll translate it. I'll transcribe it into English, and then I say, okay, there you go. I've saved the world. So give me a bonus.
But there's a reason why you're able to do what you're describing in the case of literally cracking a code. When you're literally cracking a code, you are literally figuring out a way of what you've done is you've identified bridge principles between one set of symbols and another set of symbols. In other words, if we're talking about English or German or something, or any natural language, what you have is an arbitrary symbol system. Okay, that's what any language is. I say dog, or I can say chien. But those are just two arbitrary symbols that correspond to the same concept. But the point is, a language is a symbol system. Okay, that is an information system, and a code is just a second-order information system. And that's a literal code. So you can crack that code. To say that you've cracked that code is to say that you've identified all of the relevant bridge principles that will take you from one set of symbols to another set of symbols correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and are you saying that we can't do that with DNA?
Well, we can't do it with DNA except in a completely ex post facto way. If we knew all of the laws of chemistry and all of the laws of physics, exhaustively, and if determinism is true, then of course, yes, we could look at any particular physical state in an organism, look at its DNA, for instance, and knowing everything that would unfold in the cell, we could then predict all the protein synthesis that would result. And so we could treat it as a strict input-output function. And if our knowledge was exhaustive, then yes, we could in fact predict everything. But in fact, that isn't how we do it. We don't know. We're always discovering. That's why we're sort of cracking. When we're like the Human Genome Project was a massive effort to sort of figure out what goes with what, and it's all had to be done ex post facto.
Okay. Well, like a dog with a bone, I'm not going to give up on this right away, but
you shouldn't.
But it seems to me then that you're thinking that another maybe avenue of defense there would to say, well, let's say arguendo, what you're saying right now is true, that we can't treat this as a code because this reading it after the fact type thing, and it's just an analogy.
Could I correct one little point?
Yeah, go ahead.
We can treat it as a code.
But it's not code.
It's not literally code. Yeah. Okay.
But wouldn't it be a case like if we had this further knowledge down the road that we could say this is code?
Well, no, then it wouldn't be a code because it wouldn't be an arbitrary symbol system. We could really treat it like a code. Like, man, we really are good at predicting. But that'd be the same way that we could, for instance, imagine if we had a perfect physical understanding of physics and chemistry, then when you look at the periodic table, you would, by virtue simply of looking at the periodic table, you would know no matter what chemicals you put together, under what conditions and in what combinations and in what quantities, you're going to know what the result's going to be. And
that's a perfect analogy.
Wouldn't the arbitrariness be contrary to an intelligent design? Like let's assume there was, like, well, you said like language is just this arbitrary thing, like an arbitrary range of symbols, but if there was an intelligent designer behind DNA, then we wouldn't expect that arbitrary aspect to be present.
If I could just maybe use an analogy, language as a set of symbols is an instrumental human invention that we designed ourselves to help one another communicate. So if I were to say to Ozzy, bonjour, comment ça va, in French, it would do nothing in terms of how anyone else could understand it. It wouldn't be helpful to someone who's never even heard of French. But if I were to say hello, how are you, to everyone else, oh, that's easy. Everyone understands. There's a common knowledge here. Basically, all these parties are in agreement that we're going to use the system to talk amongst each other in terms of referring to things, ideas, actions, so on and so forth. Now, we could ascribe an instrumental system to DNA, to the way these proteins in our bodies work. For example, we can isolate chemicals, say, oh, okay, we're going to attach this symbol to this specific thing, a symbol to that, and see how they react to each other. Now, it works because not of the way we're interpreting into it, or not because they're trying to communicate something to us, but because of the way that these specific proteins are interacting with each other causally. It's something we're reading into it, and we could deduce. Now, that's actually pretty incredible with any science, in terms of physics, in terms of biology, in terms of chemistry. It's just incredible that the world is so intelligible to us. But DNA is not something unique in this matter, and I think that's where the analogy is breaking up, if that can make any sense.
Yeah.
I hope I captured your point, Ozzy and Alana.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Matthew, could you repeat that point that you were making, that last point? I was sort of getting a glimpse of what you were saying there, but I couldn't quite figure it out. About the if you had a sort of a perfect intelligent designer or something like that. Where were you going with that? I think I understood what you were saying, but I'm not sure.
It's like, I think the way you identified language as an arbitrary. Well, how did you define language?
Well, it's an arbitrary set of symbols. That is, any other set of symbols. Well, almost any set of symbols could be chosen.
Yeah.
I mean, language isn't arbitrary, but what I mean is the symbol system is arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right.
Bonjour,
Right.
Hello,
Yeah.
hola, all of them.
Right.
Yeah, and where I was going with it, like, if you had an intelligent designer who actually did produce this code for the production of life, would we expect an arbitrary element to be in there, given the fact it's designed? It's intelligent designed to do that, but then I would say, well, okay, but language is designed by humans, so, but the symbols are still arbitrary that are chosen.
So there's a simpler molecule than DNA that does very similar replication in RNA. I'm sure you've heard of it. Would you say that that if there was an intelligent designer, he would have designed RNA and then DNA evolved from there? Would that be a possibility? Is that?
I'm not sure, because I'm not approaching this from a biological. I mean, I'm not a biologist or chemist and type thing. I'm just approaching this purely from a logical point of view. But the kind of picture I'm getting is like, what's interesting is that it's not biologists proposing this kind of argument, but mainly people involved in some sort of engineering kind of and computing, engineering, software kind of thing. And maybe if you work too long with the same subject, you begin to over analogize.
Yeah, what I think happens here is, because so much in biology, with respect to genetics, involves trying to predict and retrodict, what causes what, and they've decided to represent some of these things like the base pairs with letters. Then the idea of a code starts to suggest itself, and so they've borrowed this vocabulary, things like copying, transcription. When you say copying, you mean physical copying. You don't mean copying a symbol system, right? Like,
the next step is called translation. So
that's right, exactly. And so once you've started borrowing terms from a certain domain of discourse, then it makes sense, as far as possible, to keep borrowing from that domain of discourse, right? To keep applying the analogy. It makes sense, and it's a really good analogy. It's really a rich analogy. It's just somewhat misleading, and I think what ends up happening is people who work in the information sciences have a tendency to adopt a sort of information theoretical approach to everything in life. So they start looking at everything in terms of input-output functions and trying to characterize everything as if it is running a piece of software. And because anything can be described as running a piece of software. I mean, there's a sort of a famous example. This cup is running a piece of software. It has a program. It has a very, very simple program. It has a one-step program. The program says, stay there. Okay? It's a trivial program. Okay? Anything can be described. Anything that is formally describable, anything that has a behavior that is formally predictable, can be formally described and written out as a piece of software. And of course, and so anything that exhibits regularities in nature, including DNA, not exclusively DNA, can be characterized or captured as a kind of information theoretical system. And so I think that's what goes on here. And I have to say, I think that this sort of the ID argument, I mean, I'm not a proponent of it. I think it's incorrect, but I mean, that to me, I think is actually a very, very good, intuitively strong case for a God and stuff like that. I think all of the teleological arguments are among the best arguments that there are. But this one, I think, too much is being staked on the concept of code here. And that's why I sort of object to this particular argument. I'm not objecting to, in this argument, nothing that I've been saying should be construed as an argument against intelligent design. And with respect to the example that Mr. Bababui gave about sort of a simpler, more degenerate system of replication in RNA, that would be a good argument against someone who is positing a perfect, maximally efficient designer. But we don't have to posit in intelligent design theory that the designer is perfect and maximally efficient. It could be a very clumsy and inefficient designer. It's just that if he gets too clumsy and inefficient, then he becomes indistinguishable from a blind process. And so, somewhere in between maximally efficient and all-knowing and completely blind, that's where this intelligence has to be if it's going to do the work that we need it to do.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to consider the argument successfully refuted.
You might want to give it a little more thought. I mean,
no. I mean,
there might be more like.
Let's say rebutted then. The argument's been rebutted.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The argument's been rebutted because if it had not been rebutted, I would be able to respond with stronger arguments to counter the evidence put forward from Ozzy, Lana, and Babiri. I can't do that, so the argument's been rebutted. But I reserve the right to come back to you and haunt you for the rest of your life if I find out you're wrong.
No, fine.
That's okay. I reserve the right to just to not talk about any subject I don't want to talk about anymore. But but this is one I'm still interested in. So
I guess we shouldn't start pouring the champagne too soon then.
No, I mean. Yeah, but
no, because it actually does make you think a lot. When I first saw it today, I was like, wow, that's.
Can we go a little bit into the characterization of the language that it uses in DNA compared to actually human language and computer language? Can we go into that?
If you think it's necessary to continue.
I mean, I don't know about how the other ones feel, but I think there's a huge difference between human language and computer language, or how even DNA characterization is performed.
I think Epi kind of went into that a little bit, right, earlier?
Yeah, he did a little bit.
Yeah, I thought Epi characterized that well, yeah. Yeah, was there some point in particular you wanted to make about that?
No, just human language has vowels, it has synonyms, and it needs to be, categorized. I'm sorry, I may have said it wrong. But anyways, it has different characteristics, but computer language is completely different. It's just zeros and ones, and it can be interpreted by mathematics, which is also different, but it doesn't necessarily leave a message or a code or anything like that to represent it's intelligent, made.
Yeah, well, language has a semantics to it, right? Language isn't just a set of symbols or a set of oral symbols, sounds, and it isn't just a set of written symbols. There's literally, we have semantics. That is, we attach meanings to them, and the meaning is sort of intrinsic to, in our language, even though the symbols that we attach are arbitrary. But in natural language programming or ordinary programming, whether it's a chess computer or anything, what you have is a set of formal symbols, and there is no semantics that is necessarily attached to it, except the interpretation that we lend to it after the fact. So, in software, one of the big differences in this kind of code in software is the language has formally defined elements there, and you want your language to be stripped down and bare. It has as few elements as possible. You want a language, a programming language that is very, very rich and expressive, but you want the number of symbols and rules, computational rules, to be as stripped down and parsimonious as possible. That's not true in natural language. In natural language, ideally, I want to work for every concept, and if I have 5 words for the same concept, well, that's fine too, because connotation comes into it. Whereas things like connotation what's another concept I'm trying to think of here? But something like connotation is something that you don't want in a programming language, because you want your programming languages to be absolutely strict, absolutely precise, absolutely rigorous, with no haziness, no fuzziness, no connotative meaning enters into it. Everything means what it means and not something else, and everything follows sort of it follows Boolean logic normally in sort of a normal architecture, like a von Neumann architecture or something like that. So that's completely different than natural language.
Well, what I'm trying to establish with Matthew, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the information, the language that's used to interpret DNA is not enough. There's not enough data to form a language based on the characterizations of DNA. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, okay. Well, no one, but no one, I don't think, would want to suggest that DNA is a language, merely that it's a code, right?
I agree. I'm just saying that there's no intelligence behind it because there's not enough information in it.
Oh, well, no, there could be an intelligence.
I mean, intelligence.
Probably know a god or an alien species did create it.
I'm just saying there's no message in it. There's no data in it. There's no message to relay, as far as making up a language with DNA code. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I mean, let's say that a god did create all this this stuff. Did create the genetic code, so to speak. I mean, my view would be this: the fact that we can't infer an intelligent designer from genetics does not imply that a designer didn't engineer it. That could be, right? I mean,
I don't argue that. I'm just arguing.
Yeah.
Even though there is, he never put any type of information, so we can establish a language based on our code.
Okay, I guess I'm not understanding what you mean there.
I don't think anybody, ID or biologist, has ever suggested that there's any kind of language in DNA. Just pattern.
Yeah, that it works kind of like a language in that there's something like information processing going on, right?
I agree with that.
Oh, okay. So we're sort of miscommunicating with each other there. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah. If that guy Carl comes back, you're not allowed to tell him I conceded an argument.
I would call you all liars to your face if you told me that. Anyway.
Might get a surprise video.
Yeah, I conceded the argument's being rebutted. So.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I missed out on that. Damn.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. I'm sure you did.
It's live, so it's recorded. You can watch it later.
Was it based on anything I said just by chance?
No.
Okay, no.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, it was.
Well, it was actually in a way, because you were and actually you started saying it before the hangout. But well, I guess there's no point in talking about what you said before the hangout because anyone watching this isn't going to see it. But yeah,
but
if you watch the video, you'll see.
You planted the seed.
Yeah, that's right.
The first
okay,
seed.
so sort of Johnny Appleseed here in genetics. Okay.
And then Ozzy Babui and Elena, with little help from Epicurus, they killed the whole thing off.
Really?
We ganged up on him, and we tied him up.
I'm going to have to watch this then. I'm going to have to watch this. I did have one question.
Really, it's not worth watching. It's not. Okay. It's really not worth watching.
I did have one question, and if you've already dealt with it, that's fine. I'll just go back and watch it. But I was curious because at one point, Matthew, you asked me, you said that we need to look in nature and see if that we can see any other examples of a code that does not have, or that came about naturally as opposed to implying an intelligent designer. But wouldn't the whole concept of the argument sort of rule that out? So in other words, no matter, even if I found any other code that I would have found in nature, wouldn't you automatically have said the fact that it's a code indicates that it was intelligently designed?
No, I mean I think the argument is something like what the guy was proposing was, his challenge was, just produce to me one example of any code that we know the origins of, that is not the product of intelligent design. So it's basically saying laying down the gauntlet, but what's transpired is the problem is that there doesn't seem to be an analogy between the code that we see everywhere else, and like computers and things like that, and the pattern that we find in DNA.
But that, I mean, that's sort of as my point, though, is that if you, it seems that any example that could be provided would be explained or attempted to be explained with the same mechanism. That if I found something that was in fact a code, that the implied explanation there would be, well, then there must be an intelligent designer. Do you see what I'm trying to get at here?
No, because it would need to have coding in it, and it would need to be coding that wasn't intelligent design. So, I mean, for example, you referred earlier to
but isn't that sort of the premise? Is that any coding indicates intelligent design?
No, I mean the premises were that the pattern within DNA is code.
Yes.
That every other code that we know the origins of is a product of intelligent design.
Yes.
Therefore, the pattern within DNA is a code.
I agree with that. I don't have a problem with that. What I had a problem with was sort of the original throwing down of the gauntlet in terms of trying to find a code that wasn't intelligently designed. It seems like an impossible task.
No, if you look at premise 2, like premise 2 is basically saying every other code that we know the origins of is a product of intelligent design. If you could point to something that, if anyone could point to something that was a counterexample to that, then.
But that's my point. I think definitionally it would be impossible to find a counterexample.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, we almost conceded the point that any code by the certain definition of excluding like if you have a code, so with DNA, I mean DNA, we were just able to say that it's not a code by the definition that a computer code or any other code that we.
It seems to be that the word code has been imposed, is maybe being imposed upon DNA, and then because you're imposing the word code on DNA, you're then almost self-creating everything you would expect to see from code, like the encoding code, de-encoding process. And I think that needs to be re-examined in regards to whether or not, like I say, I've considered the argument, but that's open to review. But review it will be done because obviously the argument from DNA is I don't think it's not. a kind of mainstay argument for the existence of God, because even if I had spectacularly defeated every objection to my argument and it successfully went through, as is normally the case, I must emphasize to my viewers, then even if that was the case, you only get to an
so
intelligent
far.
designer.
Yes. Did Shanna concede as well? I would be curious, because that's a very common point that she brings up as DNA in her deistic argument, for the evidence of a deistic God.
Oh, Shanna's Wi-Fi crashed about halfway through, so she's not able to reconnect, and she's going to probably, if the hangout's still going, she's going to reconnect when her Wi-Fi is back up and running.
Good. So then, since she'll probably watch this to the end, let me say then that she obviously admits defeat by the fact that she left and didn't return.
No, I wouldn't be so brave. I wouldn't be so brave as to speak for Shanna.
Well, as long as she's not here to beat me, that's fine.
And bear in mind, I ran this argument from purely a logical point of view. I've not researched the matter or the subject. I just thought that's an interesting argument. I want to test that. I want to see how that can stand up to
plays out,
critical inquiry, and that's been blown apart.
I think if DNA had been code in any traditional sense, then the argument would have held up, because I agree with you. Everything that we call code is intelligently made. I just think that the argument falls apart because DNA is nothing like code.
Yeah.
You know who should have been in this conversation, though I don't think any of you know him, is James North in CRAT. I've spoken to him a few times, and he seems...
Yes, I know James.
Yeah, he's a big proponent of intelligent design, and he really knows, or at least seems to know stuff when it comes to genetics and molecular biology. I'm a complete novice.
This video and tell him to rebut it or reply to it.
But you need to be careful. It would be like if I had a hangout and I called it. Testing the Callum cosmological argument by William Lane Craig, and some individuals came on and they were able to bamboozle me with some sort of objection to the Callum cosmological argument. It would not follow from that the Callum cosmological argument by William Lane Craig has been either rebutted or refuted. It just means my presentation of it has been rebutted or refuted. I'm not Stephen Mayers, and I'm not this guy North, but the only honest thing to do is basically to say, I'm not able to defend the argument I put forward against the very well articulated objections that have taken place in the hangout. So that's my position.
I also think the point of argument is, unless you're the one who's particularly goes into it, formulates it, looks at all the specific fields of relevance to it, then really only you and probably a few others could really do a decent job at defending the argument. Say what you will about Craig, but he at least tries, in terms of the column, he actually seems to me at least be trying to go into physics and try to find scientific evidence that supports his view, or he might go into the mathematics of the nature of infinity. These are two rather huge topics and fields that could basically take a lifetime of study, and that's what's so hard to, even a simple argument, it's hard to maintain it. There's in philosophy or theology, there's really no knockdown. There are very few solid knockdown arguments for a lot of things. A lot of stuff is disputed, but that's the nature of that field. Science is much more decisive in terms of getting everyone together and just going forward, because it's so meticulous and instrumental, and the fact that you can derive so much from experimentation. You have an end goal there, where philosophy and other disciplines, even more theoretical stuff like the nature of mathematics, not necessarily math itself, but just the nature of mathematics, that could be disputed for a bit. Same with politics as well. There's always been political theories going back and forth from history.
Let's go off air.
because it's getting too long of a video.
Okay, I'm going to stop the unless anyone else has something. Anyone else got some concluding remarks they want to say? Anyone want to rub my nose in?
Sure.
Well, let me do the opposite.
Well, hang on.
He's offering.
You have to be commended for being completely open-minded and fair-minded about
Absolutely.
this. Trying out an argument in public, against people who are not disposed towards intelligent design. It actually takes some guts, and I think it displays a good deal of open-mindedness on your part to do this, and then to sort of admit, yeah, okay, I guess it's rebutted, and to say that an argument is rebutted, as you point out, is not to say that it's decisively refuted. It's simply to say that some compelling objections were presented, and equally convincing counter-arguments couldn't be put forward.
Yeah.
Before you end, I'd just like to say that finish him. Total flawless victory.
Yeah, I think I thought it was actually, even though I wasn't here, but for the beginning and the end, I agree very much so with what Ozzy just said. Cheers. I think it took a lot of guts to kind of get out there and to do that and to say, you win, lose or draw. I think it took a lot of chutzpah, so to speak, to kind of go out there in a public venue and to do that. So,
cheers.
Cheers.
I was just gonna say, and I'm sure we'll take this off air. I was just gonna say that, is there any religious argument that when it enters into the science sphere could hold up? And vice versa, can any science argument when it enters into the religious sphere hold up?
Ooh,
I think
that might be a whole nother on live episode.
Yeah.
And so Babuya leads us into our next hangout, which will take place in 10 years' time when I recover from this. No. Yeah, we can discuss that off air or another.
I got a question for you guys.
Okay, wait, I'm going to close off. Ilana, do you have a final comment since you were the deliver of my destruction?
Sorry. No, I just wanted to say, as usual, it's been a pleasure talking to you and everyone on this panel. Thanks for having me on.
Likewise, thank you.
Okay, we're going offline.
Thanks, man.